Welcome everyone. Tonight's presentation is going to be on astronomical public observing post-pandemic. The constraints haven't been entirely removed everywhere yet, but prior to them being removed, I thought I'd put together a little something that would be an educational reference for those wishing to do public outreach, to know how things might be different and how to improve it all as kind of a reset before you go out amongst the public again and offer astronomical observing. So that's what we'll be doing tonight. But first, we've got the news. So there's a Canadian company called Geometric Space Corporation, which is a subdivision, as the saying goes, a wholly owned subsidiary of Geometric Energy Corporation. And they would like to be a sub-source for selling CubeSat services to businesses that can't afford their own exclusive launch capability. SpaceX already does this, and Geometric Space is a company that's buying CubeSat slots on SpaceX Falcon 9. But they would like to get them very high in orbit and eventually, put them on the way to the moon and maybe in lunar orbit. So they want to offer more services than SpaceX might be doing for their own rideshare customers. But in order to attract attention, the first thing they're going to do is put a CubeSat in Earth orbit for advertising purposes. They're going to put a display panel on one side of the satellite, and then you will be allowed to buy digital flipping advertising time on that display. And before anybody panics about it destroying astronomical research and observing as we know it, this is a CubeSat. It's not very big. In fact, if you wanted to look at the display that you paid to have sent, your message sent up into space, you couldn't see it from the ground. It's too high up and too small. The satellite has a selfie stick and a camera on it. So that's how you'll get your confirmation that the money you paid to launch your ad campaign actually did it. The other thing is, if the satellite is facing downward when the display is on and you were to take a picture of it, you would just see black around it, because everyone knows that it's very difficult to see stars from orbit because you've got this very bright Earth in the way, and the stars are nice pinpoints of light in the absence of atmosphere. So it's hard to see them. Obviously, you can see the sun and the moon easily, some of the brighter planets easily, but it would be not a very impressive background. So by turning the satellite where the back of the satellite is facing towards the Earth, the selfie stick will take a picture of your ad display over the satellite as it roams over the surface of the Earth, maybe over the country of origin of your advertising campaign. So it's a lot of technology that's probably going to cost some ad campaigners a lot of money to do something that from a technological perspective is fairly simple. But the idea is for Geometric Space Corporation to, in the future, sell real satellite services. And in fact, they've hooked up, here's the usual, you ever hear of the phrase, it's a sub of a sub of a sub, as in subcontractor kind of thing. Geometric Space Corporation, a wholly owned subsidiary of a larger corporation, isn't actually going to be doing the interactions with SpaceX themselves. They've enlisted another company called Firefly Aerospace. Firefly Aerospace wants to eventually put a lunar lander on the moon. And eventually they want to have their own rocket. But right now, all they can afford is to buy time on a SpaceX Falcon 9. So they have this utility vehicle that they can launch CubeSats from, and they're buying Falcon 9 SpaceX time in order to launch what you see there, their space utility vehicle, which can eject CubeSats. So we're commercializing space even more so. So the Perseverance rover attempted to do its first soil sampling, first soil and rock sample, and it didn't go as planned, as the saying goes. Let me see if I can make this bigger. So you can see right here that the drill went over and it drilled a hole through this rock surface. And the idea was the probe would go in and grab some rock out of the hole and put it in one of those storage capsules for later pickup by a follow-on rover. The problem was, I think their drill is a little too good at cutting through the rock and clearing the borehole. So when they went down to pick up something, there was nothing to pick up because the part that they hadn't drilled yet was still solid rock. And the part that they had drilled was powder sitting on the top side of the hole. So I think what they need to do is just grab some of the oil, as they call it, from the top surface of the hole, pack that into a container and call it a day. And if they want actual rock grains, go over here and just scoop some up with the scoop and you'll get some native rock grains that haven't been modified. But those are sitting on the surface and have been exposed to the solar wind for a long time. So the idea is to drill down below the surface to get some pristine original stuff that hasn't been affected by solar wind. But I think if they just grab some of the powder from the spoil of the drill, they'll be fine. So we'll see what NASA does. And most of you probably know by now from last week's discussion that the launch of the uncrewed Boeing Starliner, their second attempt to successfully get it up to the ISS, didn't launch. They had some last minute problems. And I noted that they had pulled the launch vehicle away from the launch platform, which is usually an indication that they're not going to launch it soon. Well, earlier this week, they started pulling the launch vehicle all the way back to the, as they say, assembly shed for some work. Turns out that there was a valve on board the capsule, not the rocket itself, on board what would be the crewed capsule. They would have people on board. Not this time, but the next time if they were successful. The valve was indicating a certain position, but that was not known to be the actual position. So it was a false indication. So they had no way of knowing what the true position of the valve is. Now, if the valve happens to be something innocuous, no biggie, probably just replace a valve or a sensor. But I'm going to guess that the valve had some serious implications, like it was crew cabin air or hydrazine for rocket steering or emergency escape launch. You know, if something goes wrong with the main launch vehicle, how do you get the capsule off the launch vehicle and save the crew? Or it could have been something which sounds a little innocuous, like an air conditioning valve that's not working properly. The most efficient air conditioning systems they have aboard spacecraft are liquid ammonia as the refrigerant. And if you happen to have a liquid ammonia venting inside of the crew capsule, that could kill your crew. So it's a good thing that they believe that this was something to be taken seriously before it actually had a problem. If you remember the space shuttle, the problems they had with foam coming off of the liquid hydrogen fuel tank, they knew about it and ignored it for a while because it hadn't caused any serious damage until it poked a hole through the leading edge of the wing of Columbia and we lost the crew. So it's good to see that they're taking these things seriously as soon as they detect them rather than holding off. So somebody donated $100 million a while back for solar power satellites a couple of kilometers across, high Earth orbiting. And the idea is, okay, they'll generate the power, but how do you get that power down to the Earth where it can be used? Microwave beams, gigawatt microwave beams. And I thought, okay, solar power in space, yeah, that's a thing. That's okay. Generating power for use in space, that's a thing. 13-kilometer diameter satellites, That's probably not a good idea unless they're really high orbit. And if they're really high orbit, it means that for half a day, they won't be in sunlight. So if they were to put these things up at geostationary, you know, geostationary says you're going to be able to the same spot on the Earth 24/7. Well, if that's the case, half a day, it'll be in the shadow of the Earth and generating no power. So it's got to be in a lower orbit than that in order to have an orbit that's essentially sun facing 24/7. Now, you know, the ISS about every 90 minutes orbits the Earth. So it's got to be, it's got to be up higher than that. No, you don't want to use ammonia because that actually has an orbit to it. You want one that's stationary facing towards the sun. The only one I know of like that is one of the Lagrange points on the opposite side of the sun. So it always faces the sun. The problem is if it always faces the sun to generate the power, how's it going to get the power back to the Earth? So I see it as whoever this person was that donated $100 million, I wouldn't count on getting back that investment soon because the 100 million is probably just a drop in the bucket as to how much it's actually going to cost to do this where it works. And it's going to take a while, apparently, for them to figure out some of the Achilles heels of this, you know, sci-fi fantasy approach to generating power with zero carbon footprint off the Earth. So, but we'll keep an eye on it. Put a push pin in this one and come back later. So I think they did it primarily as a test, but I think they also did it just to show off. This week, the same week that Tesla was not invited to the United States government's electric vehicle show, you know, Tesla wasn't invited. It's the same Elon Musk that drives both the Tesla and the SpaceX corporate engines. So he staged a little showmanship. He took his Starship booster and Starship rocket and stacked them up so that he would go on record as having the tallest, largest rocket in the history of mankind. And then the wind started to pick up, so he took them back apart again. No firings, no testings. The claim is just wanted to see if it all fit together well. And they were very critical watching it, you know, build. And there's even videos on YouTube of it. But it's tall. It's about 60 feet taller than a fully decked out Saturn V. And that's the rocket height. That's not including the stand that's underneath it, which looks to be about another 80 feet tall. I was concerned that that much weight on top of this stand, that stand would better be very sturdy because that's what they're launching from. And it looks like, yeah, they have some very sizable girders beneath the rocket holding it all up. You can go watch the YouTube video, the NASA spaceflight video of Starship stacking. And just to show they could move multiple big heavy things around, here in the background is a test vehicle, a test chamber that was one of the ones they used to use when the Starship was shorter. And while they were dethroning the big Starship, they moved one of these over on a test stand at the same time, just to show they can, you know, do two things at once. Okay, and I've been watching this person on YouTube for a while, and she's very interesting. Her name is Fran Blanche. She looks a lot younger than she claims to be. She claims to be in her early 80s, but she looks like maybe she's in her early to mid 60s. She does basically YouTube videos for a living. So she has some Patreon followers. She has a calling on YouTube. I think at one point, yes, 228,000 subscribers. So her videos are a lot more popular than mine. But I'm not the only one that believes, you know, stop looking for ET. If ET really wants to find us, they'll find us. And the whole Fermi paradox, uh, you know, it makes the presumption that the reason why we haven't found ET is because ET doesn't exist. Otherwise, we would have seen them by now. Yeah, as she says, don't fear the paradox. And she gets into great detail as to the underpinnings of the Fermi paradox, the Drake's equation, what Carl Sagan believed, and she held up her own personal copy of, you know, physical book, Carl Sagan's Cosmos, but it wasn't personally autographed like Neil deGrasse Tyson's copy is. But she sometimes wears T-shirts that are unusual. Her T-shirt actually says "Guided by Voices."
Yeah.
But I know she's doing that as a joke because she's actually a master electronics engineer. She's got basically a lifetime membership in the IEEE. So she's a serious electronics technician. She was one of the earliest creators of what they call pedals on electric guitars. She wanted one and the company wanted way too much money for it. So her being a double E, she just built a pedal and then she made a company out of it. So she was building what they call pedals. A pedal can also be the thing that you grab that changes the tuning of the guitar. It's not like always a foot pedal. It's just something that changes the musical envelope of the instrument mechanically. So I just found her to be an interesting person to occasionally watch. I do watch other people on YouTube, including the guy that did the multiple hours on kerosene lanterns. That was a great way to consume a lot of time watching. But I'll occasionally watch her if she comes up with something new and interesting. Okay, I posted the Martian auroras video from last week on YouTube, and I did do a follow-up analysis, so I updated the content to add a couple of more slides to it. In the email that I sent around announcing the upload of it, I did indicate about how many minutes into the video you can go if you just want to, jump to just the extra stuff. I found that indeed there are particulates in the Martian atmosphere as high as 60 kilometers, and the particulates appear to be dust from the Martian surface. I think they said the smallest particles were 1 micron and the largest were 20 micron, and they were suspended in the air as long as there was wind present. So I've got to believe that when you have a Martian dust storm or any kind of upper level winds, you've got this iron compound dust high in the atmosphere. And I said, okay, all you need now is some way to energize that. And I found that this week. There is a NASA spacecraft called ACE, ACE. It's at the Lagrange L1 point, watching the sun all the time. And it recorded the solar wind containing iron ions moving at up to 500 kilometers per second in the solar wind. Iron ions, when you mix them with oxygen, become iron oxide, and iron oxide can be a nanoparticle as small as a billionth of a millimeter, which I find it hard to believe you could have an elemental compound that small, because you're now down into much smaller than visible light as a particle. I'm not talking about like a photon duality kind of particle. I'm talking about an actual particle of a compound of iron oxide. If you did have that, and that were to slam into the Martian dust grains at 60 kilometers, and they were doing even 100 kilometers per second, let alone 500, you would have an impact that would transfer energy at a particular frequency or wavelength. And I went and looked at the NIST database, and in the NIST database, there is actually an entry for what happens when iron oxide gets perturbated at that particular electron signature. And the particular signature wavelength is indeed 289.02, 289.0823 nanometers. And if you remember what NASA MAVEN and the UAE's HOPE spacecraft detected, it was UV emissions at 289 nanometers. The 0.0823 may be a truncation based upon the linear accuracy of the analog to digital converters aboard MAVEN and HOPE. So there's further legs to stand on of my postulate of where the Martian UV auroras are coming from. I sent an email off to somebody who's involved in public engagement for the Mars Curiosity rover program. They took what I sent to them and they sent it to the NASA JPL Mars public engagement team, and haven't heard back since, but we shall see.
So I know that's a lot of work. I know that's a lot of work, Monroe, but I'm very glad you did it.
Well,
but I think it's very good. Thank you.
It may just be a rat hole wasting time, but as you could tell from my 3D printing, I don't have a problem wasting time if the end result turns out to be for a good cause. And given that NASA has no explanation as to why Mars has aurora in UV and not at other wavelengths, and they're very prominent, and these aurora, they've monitored them for 5 consecutive days. So they're long-lived aurora, which usually would indicate it's not just a specific coronal mass ejection, it's the solar wind itself that's powering it. So we'll see if I've just sort of poked them with a small sharp stick, and maybe they'll think about it. But the one thing,
usually, like you're saying, iron is what you believe that's on Mars. But what is usually there, and what would make if they did find out it was iron, would this help them with anything?
Yes, it would help them understand the atmospheric chemistry of Mars a little better and what kinds of energy sources are powering it. Because right now they're saying that Mars does not have a sizable magnetic field and therefore shouldn't have a traditional Earth-style aurora. There are some that, well, we've detected some magnetic field, and then it's, well, if there's a magnetic field, does that mean that Mars still has a metallic moving core? Well, the InSight rover on Mars now for over 10 years has been detecting Mars quakes, Mars version of an earthquake, and it detects those regularly. So that presumably says there is a molten, at least, inner layer beyond the surface of Mars, but they haven't found any tectonic plates. So the normal source of earthquakes of tectonic plates shoving one over the top of the other, that wouldn't be the cause of the earthquakes. So there's a lot of unanswered questions involving Mars inner workings, geology, and auroras, and maybe this is just something for them to go take a look at. They do have the instruments available that are in the proper range, so they could just task them to go do some observations. And since Curiosity's not fully occupied and doesn't want to move around too much because its wheels could get stuck, they could just task Curiosity to point the ChemCam on the mast towards where the aurora is as detected by Maven and Hope, and see if it can pick up anything as a UV signature. So we'll see what NASA does and whether they get back to me and go, no, it's not that, you silly member of the public. Okay.
But also, I don't know. I know we can't breathe the air or atmosphere
It's
on.
carbon dioxide, and it's low pressure at that. You're not going to breathe on Mars without a spacesuit.
And so there, it's what's in it? Oxide?
Carbon dioxide.
Oh, carbon dioxide. Exactly what we don't need.
Exactly what we don't
Okay.
need. Yes.
And that would be the same thing if, say, there wasn't the carbon dioxide, everything else was okay. This iron would be a problem with breathing then too.
Well, that is kind of a problem because nanoparticles of iron oxide are not good for human lungs.
Yeah.
So we already know that on the moon, the due to the solar wind and micrometeoroid impacts, the dirt of the moon, the soil, not that there's anything plantable, there's no organic material in the soil, but that fine grain of sand is actually ground up volcanic glass. And that's not good to get in your lungs. And there were some of the Apollo astronauts that came down with respiratory congestion based upon that ground glass being on the outside of their spacesuits when they got back aboard the LIM. So if you go to Mars, you have the same sort of problem. You have this very fine grain sand that has chemistry in it that's not good for the human lungs. So if you've seen some of the proposed rovers for Mars, you don't actually put on your spacesuit inside the rover and then go out through an airlock, roam around on Mars getting dirt all over yourself, and then walk that dirt back into your spacecraft and take off your spacesuit inside your spacecraft under the correct pressure. Your spacesuit's actually built into the outside of your spacecraft, your rover on Mars. You open a chamber inside your spacecraft, you crawl into your spacesuit, you lock the chamber behind you, and there's an airlock that allows you to detach from the rover. So the outside of your spacesuit never makes it to the inside of your rover to
That's
avoid
amazing.
this fine grained stuff getting in the lungs of astronauts.
No, they'll track it in anyway.
I'm sure they'll find a way. Ask anybody who has the responsibility of cleaning a floor. People
Yeah.
always find a way to track dirt in. You can
Yeah.
put out the welcome mats all you want, but they'll find a way.
I think if you watch The Martian, you can see the concept.
Oh, is it
Yes.
on there?
Yes.
Yes, I think
Well, no,
the
they just, on the Martian, they just have an airlock. One of the unrealistic parts of the movie is they ignored the fine grained particulate in the Martian regolith. And
no, the rover works like that. The spacesuit was
the
outside.
rover did. Yes, the rover did, but their actual facility that they lived in on Mars did not.
Oh, okay.
And if you remember, when he had to plant the potatoes in the human feces fertilizer, he was spreading Mars soil inside, not wearing a spacesuit. So the science drifted away from fact a little bit there. Anyway, particulate matter on other worlds is something you have to worry about. Earth has a sizable enough gravity and a heavy enough air pressure. And we've been, in this particular chemistry of atmosphere such a long time that stuff like airborne dust, and we may sneeze from it, but it's not going to, kill a majority of people. Whereas us being exposed to lunar glass or Martian glass is not a healthy thing. We have to find ways to make that as unlikely as possible.
Wow.
That's just stuff you got to think about when you're doing this stuff.
Yeah, I'm thinking that that's so neat, though, that they had to crawl into their suit in this other thing, that you would thought that they would have enhanced that into the movie.
Well, they did for the rover. They just didn't for their actual home they lived in on Mars.
Oh, okay.
And you only want to, at some point, the technical minutia gets in the way of the progressing of the movie story. So they
Yeah.
just abandon certain science as, well, let's just assume that's not a problem. Get in the spacesuit, go through the airlock. We know about airlocks. Everybody in the audience can understand an airlock. But getting into your spacesuit through the back wall of your rover, that's a little weird, unless you've actually seen the videos. And then you realize, hey, they're paying attention to good science in this movie. I like this movie. But at some point, you just have to go, it is a fantasy, science fiction. It is for entertainment. If they want to go outside the bounds of what would be expected science, that's fine. Right up until you have some commercial program that wants to go to Mars and doesn't pay attention to that. And then,
Right.
you've got organizations like, hopefully NASA will just go, but what about, and just stop them or make them take that into account and then rework whatever they're going to do and make it safer.
You liked Martian, the movie Martian.
I like the movie The Martian, yes.
I think
was
the book
entertaining.
goes into more detail. The book
Well,
is full of detail.
I don't want the book to spoil the movie though.
It always does.
People always say the other way around. The
No.
movie wasn't as good as the book.
Not true. Not always.
Well, sometimes the book isn't as good as the movie. And sometimes if people pay attention, you'll actually realize they wrote the book from the screenplay after the movie was already made, before the movie was released, because that way they could sell a book.
Right. Mm-hmm.
One of the companies notorious for this is Time Warner.
Mm-hmm.
Time Warner had The Matrix, all 3 movies in the can, and then took the screenplays and wrote a book for each one of the movies. That way they could sell a book as well as the screenplay, as well as the movies in the cinemas. And they owned Turner Broadcasting System. So when it came on, commercial television, they still made money. So it's the long-lived milk train of intellectual property production and distribution. And I'm in awe of how well Warner Brothers does this as to, okay, so the Suicide Squad, their latest movie, it showed up in the theaters and on HBO Max customers at the same time. And then they complained that they only took in $23 million its first opening weekend in the theaters.
Not enough. Not enough.
Not enough. Not enough. The problem was, and I actually suffered through this until today, I wanted to watch the movie the same day it opened. In fact, the same hour it opened online. The video kept pausing and then recouping itself because their servers couldn't feed video frames to the multi-million person audience that already paid for HBO Max or had received HBO Max for free because they're an AT&T unlimited mobile service customer.
Mm-hmm.
So they gave away too much. They took it off the table, so to speak. And I think the reason why they did that is, if people are paying attention, AT&T wants to sell itself out from underneath its media empire of Warner Brothers and DirecTV and all that stuff. They want to get back to just doing mobile phones, because all these other things, in light of the pandemic, suddenly were a big sinkhole of money. They would create these multi-$100 million products that there weren't any audiences for because the theaters shut down. So you got to keep juggling the plates, and it doesn't matter how many billions it costs AT&T to do this. They just do it. So look for your AT&T Now app to suddenly become a DirecTV app. It's the same people underneath it doing it. It's just a different parent on top. But when Yahoo was acquired by Verizon, and they realized that Yahoo provides the email services to AT&T, a competitor of Verizon. Verizon started doing things that made AT&T's life difficult as a email services provider. And AT&T never got the memo, as the saying goes, to say, we should get a different email service provider than one of our competitors. Okay, so no word back yet from county parks or the county STEAM team as to when public outreach will be resumed by Broward County. But I've still got my name into the queue for those, so we'll see. Which is also why tonight we're doing the getting prepared for doing public outreach again. And I also included an email for people that missed it, my Broward County Library Creation Station video. And then I've got a long detailed blather about my failing to 3D print the James Webb Space Telescope and how I'm going to sort of go it on my own. I did make a change in the lineup of the videos for the next coming weeks because I spent so much time 3D printing, and because I started to get some results from the IP camera, the pan tilt zoom camera as an astronomy camera. I pointed it at Jupiter, and for about 2 seconds I had Jupiter and you could see bands and moons, and then the camera took over and said, oh, obviously the exposure is wrong on that thing, and so's the focus, and it just destroyed the view. So I've got to find a way to command it to say, turn off your LEDs, turn off the autofocus, turn off the auto exposure. Let me just control it externally. And I think it will be fine, because for a brief couple of seconds, I was able to see Jupiter, dark bands on Jupiter and a couple of moons. I didn't see it long enough to know which moons, what was the orbital pattern. But I think it will work as soon as I get a few things out of the way, but no use to talk about it until I found solutions to those problems. So given that I've spent a lot of time learning about spectroscopy and reliving my high school and college physics classes on electron orbital theories and quantum physics, let's say, I decided, well, let's shove things around here. And so next week, there will be a presentation on spectroscopy and spectroscopes and how spacecrafts use those things. And so that will replace the pan tilt zoom camera session that was scheduled for next week. I'll move that out a few weeks. And then we'll
Because
do
all the astronomy is actually chemistry.
Yes. But if you watch Fran's video, you'll realize she, like I, believes that eventually civilizations grow out of using modulation of the electromagnetic spectrum for communication, because it just doesn't work long distance. There's a huge time lag. It gets distorted by cosmic winds, and you need to find a better way of communicating long distance. And neither she nor I have a solution to that problem, but it's just nice to see that someone else on the planet thinks the same
Alike.
cockamamie way I do. So the following week will be the extraterrestrial experience. This is attempting to put humans in the shoes of extraterrestrials, or as they would like to refer to us, silly humans. Remember, we need to be prepared. They're arriving next Thursday. And don't be fooled by the Fermi paradox, because the zoo hypothesis counters that. And Frank Drake's equation came out decades before we realized there's over 100 billion stars just in our galaxy alone. So even if you kept Frank Drake's original equation, the quantity of advanced civilizations that should exist just in our galaxy moved up from maybe hundreds to probably more than 10,000. So with a grain of salt, as the saying goes. And one thing that Fran did that I have yet to do is create a survey for my members for them to respond to fixed questions as to what would you like to see in future presentations. And whenever you do a multiple choice survey, the answers are already defined. And if you throw in a category of other and you don't provide a way of typing in what other means, it doesn't really provide you with information. So I've done, polling analysis before to realize that polls will find the answer that you want, but they may not find the answer that you like. And Fran found this out as she put out a poll, and her multi-100,000 person subscriber audience responded. And what she found out was the presentations that she originally planned was not what people wanted to see. It was the stuff that she knows isn't going to be long-lived, as far as how many of them can you do before you run out of steam. That was what people wanted. So she's in a quandary at the moment as to where do I take my YouTube channel from here? So in another, maybe 6 weeks or so, I may be in the same quandary of now what do I talk about? So I'll be looking forward to just shoot me an email, and whether you do the presentation or I do the presentation, I'm willing to help people create presentations. Back with the other group, Sally's done this before. Obviously no long PTSD scars. It wasn't life-threatening, and people can learn from it and become comfortable or oblivious, in my case, to the pressures of presenting. Okay, any other news items that I might have missed?
There's been a lot of Facebook news of space these days. You notice that?
Yeah, I've noticed, but a lot of it is rehash. And whenever I post one of these news articles, for individual article, I might go to 5 different sites and see pretty much the same article. But what I try and do is, if it's really a science technical thing, I will try and find the root source of the information. So if I see that some magazine is hyping some finding by a physicist, I will go find the institution that the physicist works in and find their PR release, because that's likely to contain more technical details, which I know we love, than the media hyped version of it. Especially if it's something like, there's a comet headed our way and it's going to kill us all. No. It's the biggest comet of all time. No, it's not.
It came yesterday. Yeah.
It is at 11.
I just want to know, were the aliens on board the comet when
they were driving it? Yeah, they were driving it. Yeah.
Well, remember that was Oumuamua 2's explanation is the aliens were piloting this long submarine-like spacecraft through our solar system, doing analysis on us silly humans, and they went through and out the other side, and they never stopped by to say hi.
Well, if you have, you're lazy and don't want to read the scholastic papers, I normally go for BBC Science and also NPR. So those are the ones that have like the news articles well written, and also though there is no links that you just clog at the screen of your phone that you cannot read the article. So those are my go-to. But because I've been doing this for a long time, I am in a email list for NASA, for ESA. So I have like source material that comes to my email. But other than that, if you want to just look around what happened in a week, I advise the BBC and NPR. They're always like the best articles, and they are always well written. And they have the links of these scholastic papers for you to read if you wish.
Mhm.
Well, wasn't there an article NASA is looking for 4 people to live in a simulated Martian environment for a year?
Yes,
Uh,
and I think I'm gonna apply for it.
the other thing is the house that you'll be living in is 3D printed.
So Monroe and Helen, you were just keeping that a secret to increase your odds?
No, I was keeping it as I don't think of that as news, because if you look how long that program has existed, NASA's had a Mars survival program for 20 plus years. And every so often they put another team in. And typically what it does is it induces psychoses in the team if they try and, leave them cut off from society too long, especially if they're younger people.
But I've been training for 1.5 years for it.
You're a different caliber of individual. The ones that they want to get in there are younger people that are glued to their Facebook and their Twitter, and all of a sudden they get cut off from that cold turkey, and psychologically they don't do well.
No, I mean, everybody in the planet has been training for 1.5 years because
Yeah,
of the pandemic. Everybody's training to go to Mars.
yes, but imagine if Amazon would only arrive every 2 years.
Yeah, that's the most difficult.
Yeah, that's, if you're really cut off for 2 years,
Mm.
you better be prepared for it.
But
Because if
I'm
you're,
good because I don't order stuff from Amazon. I normally order stuff from eBay. It takes 2 to 4 months to arrive.
well, imagine that 2 months becoming 6 months at a minimum.
And then not talking to my mom every other day and talking for 2 hours instead, having, email or voice emails
you-
that
you-
arrive like half hour later.
Yeah, you could have a conversation with her, but it would be one way, 20 plus minutes lagged. Another reason that modulation of the electromagnetic spectrum is not the way to do long distance communications.
But I'm seriously tempted because it's the age is like the age limit is 55, so I'm in the age limit.
How long does it take them to approve you?
I don't know. I'm gonna need help from you, like you did the next time.
I would not be your +1 in this case.
No, not +1. It's just to help me, like you helped me with Sophia, with
Oh,
the
sure.
paperwork and stuff.
I would not have a problem assisting you with your
The application.
application, as well as if you need a ground crew assistant.
Yes,
But
please.
you're on your own as far as the mission goes.
Okay.
I'm on the primary planet, and until they get the technology a lot better, I'm here.
So, and the other thing that I did, I inscribed my name from the OMAs. So it's a website that you go for. It's like a raffle that you go through, and it's like a
Yes.
big, like big network, a raffle for.
Yeah, the OMAs is Branson's flight.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I inscribed myself with like I think I bought like 1,000 tickets or 4,000 tickets. I bought like a bunch of tickets to go for the Branson flight.
Okay. Well, I've seen it go up and I've seen it come down successfully. But remember, that's also the same organization that lost a pilot and co-pilot.
Okay. So I am trying to decide who am I going to bring. One that says no already and one that is thinking about. That's you or my mom. Because it's a +2.
I think you should bring your mother,
Yes.
because the first question will be, somebody's going to have to pay for her to come here and take the training. because the Virgin Galactic, there is, what was it, 20 days worth of training or something? It was a non-trivial number of days of training and education that you need, because they actually have a pilot and co-pilot on board their spacecraft. And if something goes wrong, you need to be minimally aware of
What to do.
But in the case of Amazon Blue Origin, literally it's autonomous. There's no pilot, there's no co-pilot.
All you can do is say, oh shit.
Basically tuck your head between your legs and kiss your ass goodbye.
Yes.
So, you know,
Yeah, but,
I
you
think
know,
they said they got 20 minutes worth of training, and the most strenuous exercise they had to do was climbing the zigzag staircase up to the capsule. And they did that once before just to prove that they had the cardiovascular capability to do it. And I'm thinking, isn't this a multi-billionaire? Put in a damn elevator.
Yeah.
If you really want tourists to do this flight, put in an elevator.
and you know how I convinced her to do it? I told her, Mom, nothing happens. We're going to be happy and enjoying the time together. If something happens and I die, you would be on the ground wishing you have said like, oh, I should have gone.
Yeah.
So what is the difference? They're like, oh, okay, I will think about it. So
Just remember, if you do win it and you're going to get on there, I want to buy the in-flight insurance,
okay.
because the way my unwinning odds are, you know, if I spend $20 to get $1 million in insurance, you're guaranteed safe all the way up and all the way down.
Okay, I don't mind.
Yeah. Well, you wouldn't have to pay for it. I'd pay for the insurance.
I know. I don't mind. As long as you bequest my nephews and nieces with college, I'm good.
Make it $2 million.
Okay.
I got to give him a piece of the action.
Yes, so far I have 4.
Okay. I think 2 million will cover it.
Okay.
So good evening. Tonight's presentation is on astronomical public observing post-pandemic. I thought it was time to get people prepared so that if the constraints are lifted and we start doing public astronomical observing again, that we take into account some lessons we might have learned and use this as an opportunity to adjust maybe some equipment that is not appropriate given the new normal. So let's just take a look at that. So whether we like it or not, this is, whatever it is going to be our new normal, and we just have to cope with it. We can either choose to discontinue face-to-face public astronomical observing. We can migrate to online only sessions, or we can adapt. So if you're watching this presentation and your choice is not to learn, not to adapt, then maybe this presentation isn't meant for you. But as far as the learning how to do public outreach astronomy, a little more appropriate to your audience, a little more audience satisfying, there are some pointers in here you might gain from. So a lot of this is my opinion. I've been doing astronomical observing public outreach for about 15 plus years. And I've done it both daytime, nighttime, in city bright lights, as well as very dark rural sites. And not only do I own a bunch of different kinds of equipment and brands, but I've also had a lot of experience in helping people who have just bought equipment that they know nothing about learn how to use their equipment. So that I think of as, I've watched my mistakes and other people's mistakes, learn from them, don't repeat them. So as I said, this is my opinion, and opinions vary. But whatever your opinion is, as far as the equipment and the approach to doing public outreach, don't base it upon just what you own that you've paid thousands for and you don't want to hear any bad talk about it. And don't base it upon a particular brand name. because different companies make different products, and not all their products can be winners. And sometimes companies don't do well and they get acquired by other companies, which just recently happened with Mead being acquired by Orion. So don't lock all your eggs into one brand basket. And whatever equipment you use should not be based upon how large an aperture you can afford, particularly if you're doing this from city lights. As a reminder, the formula for optical magnification in a telescope does not include the telescope diameter. It's just not a part of the math. It's the focal length of the telescope divided by the focal length of the eyepiece. It's that simple. That gives you your X on how many times something is magnified. And if the public wants a fill the eyepiece view, a larger diameter telescope all by its own without getting a longer focal length doesn't change that. And also, if you have a shorter focal length telescope with a lower F ratio, you're providing a wider field of view. So if you're in a city light polluted location and you provide someone an instrument to look through that has a 3-degree field of view, and you're observing the moon, a planet, or a bunch of stars, you're actually taking in more light from the background light pollution than from your celestial target. Okay, whether it's post this pandemic or the next pandemic, these kinds of disruptions to our public outreach workflows, they're going to happen from time to time. So let's work towards preparing for the best possible outcomes and take into account some of the things we've learned about when you have to mask, how to mask, when you have to do social distancing, how to do it, because it looks like these things are going to be with us for some time to come. And this presentation might not have all the answers, but it tries to consider many of the issues and attempts to provide solutions. Hopefully they're all practical. So let's talk first about how you can be shut down by things like pandemics and other sorts of lockdowns. There's 3 stages that I came up with. The first is basically a complete public lockdown. The second thing is some form of partial lockdown, and then no lockdown, kind of almost business as usual. So if it's a government instituted public lockdown, the authorities are not providing you the opportunity to do public events. It's just not going to happen. Go online, learn how to do it online. That way you can remind people that you still exist, you're still important, you can still provide a contribution to education of the public, maybe entertainment to the public in my case. If there is a partial lockdown, that's really the point of this presentation is, if we're not completely unconstrained, we're doing some things differently. What do we need to do differently? How do we need to do it to get back to the point where we can have an adapted form of face-to-face public astronomy outreach? And if there's no lockdown, a lot of the original norms will return. It's unlikely that it's going to be business as usual prior to the pandemic, but maybe we'll learn some things and do some things different, whether we're facing a pandemic or not. So the first thing we have to pay attention to is conformance at multiple levels, at the national or federal level, state or your province, if you're in a state that has provinces or a nation that has provinces, counties or cities, parishes, and communities, depending upon what kind of social organization you're in. The event site, where you're actually doing it, in case you don't own control over that property. Your host organization, if you're a member of an astronomical group, you may have conformance rules that you have to obey set forth by your organization. And anytime you're under some form of guidelines, any guidelines that you execute should be nothing less than those of the site. So you may find that, national or state or even county has loosened things up, but you're at some public library that says, oh, no, we still believe in masking here. We still believe in social distancing here, even though at higher levels of authority, they've relaxed those. So you have to obey the site as being the first most stringent conformance that you have to abide in. The kinds of things you might have to conform to, that is assuming you can still do some kind of public outreach. The first one is social distancing, and you might realize that there's actually two social distancing distances. There's the 2 meter and the 3 meter, or the 6 foot and the 10 foot. 3 meters is not quite 10 foot, but it's close enough. The next thing is masking. And if you're expecting the masking as a matter of conformance to either an organization's policy or to a state, county, federal policy, you're going to want it to be true masking and not a gaiter. And for those that don't know a gaiter is kind of the Old West mask that comes up over your nose and actually extends down onto your chest. And if you're wearing a single layer of that, it may be easier to breathe through those, but that's your clue that they're not doing much in the way of filtering. And even if you do have a multi-layer mask, you want to make sure it's not like this, and it's not like this, it's actually like this. So it actually covers the parts of you that can take in particulates or produce particulates, which, you don't know what the level of infection might be. If there's vaccinations that are available and you're the one that is hosting the public outreach event, then in all likelihood, it would be good for you to get the necessary multiple shots and boosters if necessary for whatever vaccine you've taken, because then you're protecting yourself from the public that you don't know their level of vaccination, but you're also protecting the public because you're less likely to give it to them. Now, it's not 100%, but it's a protection mechanism that's available to you, that if you get them through a governmental organization, they don't cost you anything. If you get them through certain pharmacies under subsidy programs, again, they don't cost you anything because either the government or your insurance policy is paying for it. So, we're born getting lots of vaccinations. I know there are people that don't believe in them, but you'd be surprised at things that you get yourself vaccinated for that you never realized it until you took your own assessment. Like when you were growing up, did your parents get you the multiple diphtheria vaccinations? Didn't come down with diphtheria. Quantity, percentage of children that do is very small. So it's really science that does work. It's not 100%, but it's science that works. So pay attention to it. It's advisable to have a prohibition on physical contact, whether they're infecting you or you're infecting them. That's another form of social distancing, be it handshakes, hugs. Here's one that comes to mind in astronomy public outreach. When a child does not know how to look through an eyepiece, the number of times I've seen adults and even some amateur astronomers grabbing the head of the child and literally pointing their eyeball into the eyepiece. Well, you shouldn't be doing that anymore. The other one is helping people onto and off of a ladder. If your ladder requires assistance, maybe you need to look at a different kind of ladder or the circumstances under which you're requiring a ladder to be used. And, prohibition on eyes on eyepieces, maybe that's going to be a thing when, let's say the CDC or somebody comes out with their guidance on public astronomy. But just realize that things like eyepieces and ladders that you have to climb are potential sites for public contamination and transmission. So maybe start looking at doing visual live observing through video as opposed to through an eyepiece. Just suggesting. Nighttime and daytime. I've been doing astronomy outreach for more than a dozen years. And I would say about a third of the time I would do it in the daytime. The other 2/3 I would do it at night. But even when I did it at supposed night, it might start late in the daytime and then end in the nighttime. We did that a lot at the libraries, primarily because of daylight saving time. If you can put together a program that works in the late daytime to early nighttime transition, then you have something that works. If you put something together that only works at nighttime, you're not doing all you can do. If you put together something that only works in daytime, because then you can see everyone and you can see that they're masked or not, if that's what's needed, you can assist in social distancing, by putting stripes on the sidewalk or chalk marks. If your solution only works in the daytime, you're not doing as much as you could do. So if you can come up with whatever solution you've got that works both nighttime when you can't see your attendees and works daytime when you can see your attendees, then you have a solution that really works. Otherwise, you've got one that's good for nighttime or good for daytime, but no crossing over and no opposites. So the astronomy equipment itself. If you've been doing public outreach for astronomy for a number of years, you probably have realized there's definite differences between the equipment you take for public outreach versus your own personal enjoyment equipment versus equipment you might use for deep sky, long exposure astrophotography. They're just different optics, different focusing, different uses of a computer. They're just different. And that being the case, don't bring a knife to a gunfight. Don't bring a deep sky astrophotography rig to a daytime public outreach event. It just won't work right. It's not going to come out. So large diameter, low focal ratio, wide field telescopes are not the best for public outreach, especially in city light pollution. Most of what you're going to want to see in cities are small targets like the moon, planets, star clusters, the Orion Nebula. These are not multiple degree wide targets. These are small. Wide field is going to draw in more light pollution than target. The other thing to note is if your public wants a nice sized target to look at, you don't want them to go, which one of those dots is Saturn? It's the obvious big one with the rings. Which one is that again? Then you don't have enough magnification on your target. You probably have a short focal ratio telescope, and you're apt to need a Barlow lens, which is going to be expensive, or a Nagler, which is going to be expensive, and you're probably using 1 1/4 inch eyepieces, which are less expensive, but they're harder to look through. So let's use this resumption of outreach as an evaluation opportunity to adjust the equipment to be more appropriate to public observing expectations given the new normal. So bring equipment appropriate for city public observing outreach, and you won't have a problem when you go to a dark site. That part will still work. So manual versus go-to tracking mounts. If you've ever used a manual mount at a public observing outreach event, you realize that every person or every other person, you have to manually adjust the position of the telescope to manually make it track an object you're looking at in the sky. Think about it this way. That means that every person or every other person, you need to break the social distancing guidelines to get yourself to the telescope while there's a person at the telescope, so you can look in the eyepiece to line it back up so they can then look. You don't want to have to say, okay, I need to adjust the telescope. Please step down and move 6 feet away from the telescope, and then I'm going to adjust it. get it in there, and then you quickly come back to the telescope and look at it. Because if you take too long to get back, the object will be out of the eyepiece again. So a computerized go-to mount with tracking stays on the target, and you can remain socially distanced without, doing anything. And the other thing is, if you have to periodically adjust your telescope position, that distracts from the conversation you'd like to have with the public. So if the telescope is tracking the target and the audience can just look at it, then you can be talking to that person at the telescope or the people in line. So you can give the people in line something to do and think about on their way up while they're waiting in line. Typically, a manual scope means you've got a Dobsonian, which is a Newtonian reflector on a Dobsonian style altitude azimuth mount, and you're literally swinging it around the sky. But as I said, that breaks social distancing. And if you did want to do video, how do you mount the second telescope, for doing the video? So they're a bit impractical given the new normal. And if you're going to get a go-to mount, get one that can track the sun so that you can do daytime outreach too. The mount itself, I highly recommend an altitude azimuth mount, not a polar or equatorial mount. And if it can take advantage of a GPS receiver to know location, date, and time as you go to do setup, that means it takes less time and effort to set it up, to tear it down. It's more accommodating of being bumped if you have to reset it. An equatorial mount that requires Polaris is a problem because how do you do that in the daytime? Well, you kind of eyeball it. You can't see Polaris, but you eyeball it and it's close enough, if you just point it north. Actually, if you want to track the target for a while, it's not going to be close enough. You're going to have to adjust it. And if you can't see north because there's a building in the way or a tree in the way, that's not going to work. And also, even though they may have a GPS, some brands of telescope mounts still require multiple star alignment to be done even in the daytime. So that's something to look out for if you're buying something. And plate solving, this is a feature on some of the newer mounts. That's where the telescope has a camera built in and it takes pictures of what it's looking at, and then it takes the pattern of stars and matches them to known patterns to know where the telescope is pointing, and then move the motors to realign the telescope. Well, first off, there's only one star that you can typically see without a telescope in the daytime, and that's the sun. So plate solving doesn't work in the daytime. It also doesn't work at light polluted sites where man-made light might be confused as being a star, and then your plate solving won't work. And obviously plate solving won't work if there's buildings or foliage, trees and shrubs in the way. And it's time for pictures. So people like pictures. So here's pictures, and it's got X's and checks, and here's pictures. So the ones marked X in red are the ones I personally don't recommend. The ones with the green checks, I may own a couple of these, and I may recommend some of them. So I don't own an Ioptron AZ Mount Pro. I know a couple of people that do, and they're very satisfied with them. I know 3 owners, but they're back ordered at the moment. I guess enough constraints on public outreach are opening up that people are buying them again, and they're not making them fast enough. I was disappointed to see that Ioptron discontinued the IEQ 45 alt azimuth mount. It was heavier, a bit more expensive than the AZ Mount Pro, but it would take my very largest telescope, my 180 millimeter Max-Uthoff Cassegrain, whereas the AZ Mount Pro is kind of straining on taking that. But I noticed that Skywatcher has a new generation of alt azimuth mounts out called the AZEQ 5 and 6. They don't even show the pictures of it in equatorial mode. They only show pictures of it in altitude azimuth mode. But it's labeled as back ordered, but I never actually saw it go into production. So I'm going to guess that it's been announced and they're taking orders for it, but they're maybe not shipping it yet because of, pandemic issues. But I don't have any experience with it. But I have a great deal of experience with the Cube Pro, the Mini Tower, which is very similar to the Azimuth Pro, and also the IEQ 45. And those are all very good telescopes for doing altitude azimuth, daytime as well as nighttime. The tripod, the thing that the telescope mount is sitting on top of. I'm recommending use tripods, not piers. A pier is the post that has short little squat legs at the bottom of it, as opposed to a tripod that has, the three sort of higher angular legs. And I'll tell you why. I've actually seen somebody go through this experience. If somebody trips over a tripod leg, the sloping leg is the first thing they'll encounter. So they may grab your tripod or the leg, but they're not going to be grabbing your telescope unless they really get flailing around in the dark. So there's something that they can fall back on, so to speak. If you're using a pier and it's got a low leg or foot on it, if they stumble over that, there's only one thing they're going to be grabbing, your telescope, because that's the first biggest thing they can latch onto. It almost knocked over his pier and mount when the person fell onto his pier, but that was just a trip in the dark and he was using a pier. Also, if you are using a tripod, make sure that it supports and you have installed the spreader bar for stability. And I've also found out that lowering the tripod height reduces the need for an observing ladder. And we'll get to ladders next up. So, more pictures. 3 tripods. The first one's a pier type tripod. And that was actually the model that the person tripped over. The lightweight camera tripod that has no spreader plate in the center, that's just too wobbly. If somebody falls on that, it's going to crush the tripod. Get a tripod that has a spreader bar. That's the thing at the bottom, but also it has a spreader plate at the top that screws up into the base of the mount. It's a very stable way to set up a telescope. Ladders. Ladders can be a public safety issue if you're not using the correct type. Also, an inappropriate ladder creates a large surface area that is a source for contamination and requiring periodic cleaning. And the cleaning may be more than just, once every event. It may be every few people, depending upon how humid the environment is. If you must use a ladder, pick one of the hoop top type ladders, not a step stool that has no top on it, and not an A-frame or extension ladder that is expected to be fairly tall when all you need is a step or two. The other thing a hoop top does is give the observer a specific place to grab onto that isn't your telescope. It also constrains the area that might need sanitation cleaning to just the upper part of the hoop, because that's the only thing they're going to grab onto. When you choose a ladder, find one that has wide rubber covered steps for better stability, better traction. It's great for seniors. And if it's a young child, they can literally have their parent heft them up onto the flat platform with the rubber on it for them to look in the telescope. Don't get a ladder that has stamped bare metal treads, because a lot of kids show up at these events barefoot and it's sharp on their feet. And the bottom of the ladder is also important. Make sure that the bottom of the ladder has feet on it and it's not just open pipes, because occasionally you'll encounter unlevel ground or soft dirt and you don't want the ladder sinking into the ground and suddenly somebody toppling over. And choose a ladder of the appropriate height to put kids' eyes at the height to look in the eyepiece, so that they're not too high and they're not too low. An average size, let's say 5-year-old That's where you want the eyepiece given the ladder. And you want them to take whatever count of steps you have in your ladder. That's the most they should have to take. They can take one less than that, but they shouldn't have to climb up higher. Lots of ladder pictures. So a simple folding stool. It sounds very convenient. I've seen these used, but a child on one of those, it's very easy for them to come to the conclusion they can jump off of that. And that's not a thing for them to jump off of. Same thing as the non-folding, much sturdier metal single step. Metal single steps like this are used in doctor's office as a way for shorter people to get up onto the examining table. That's where those came from. Then there's the old style kitchen step stool. Very nicely folds away. If you have to get to the second level of your cupboards, it becomes a watch your step because you can walk off the top of that and you're too high up to plop down on that and you're apt to fall. Short A-frame ladders or even extension A-frame ladders or even a hoop top ladder that's got like 4 steps on it. These are too tall. It puts the person at the wrong position. So don't go for those. Plus the A-frame extension ladders are quite heavy. They fold up nicely, but you've got a chunk of weight all in a small space, so they get quite heavy. I prefer the one all the way on the right that you can get those at Target or Walmart. They have large flat steps. They're rubber covered. There's a roll bar at the top, a hoop top at the top, and it actually has rubber over the center of it. So it gives you a more narrow area to clean if you have to clean it. Plus, it's the right number of steps. If they have to go more than 2 steps, maybe your telescope tripod is too tall. It can be shortened down. Now for the telescope itself. Although they're a fun experience, large aperture classical Dobsonian Newtonians are to be avoided because when you want to point at something directly overhead, they can require a much taller ladder, which is a public safety issue, and also requires them to climb the ladder, which means you have to clean the height of the ladder for safety. My recommendation is a Maksutov Cassegrain at f12 or greater. I know f10 Schmidt Cassegrains are quite popular, but they're just a touch low on the magnification. And by going up to a longer focal length that gives you an f12, you get a noticeable amount more magnification. They're narrower in their field of view, which means they exclude more light pollution. They're inherently higher in magnification using the same focal length eyepiece. So you are unlikely to need a Barlow multiplier or a Nagler. Naglers are typically expensive, and there's a lot of layers of glass, 8 to 12 elements of glass, which can reduce brightness. Also, longer focal length eyepieces have a wider aperture, so they're easier to look through. And if you can use a 2-inch eyepiece, a true 2-inch eyepiece, and a longer focal length eyepiece, it makes the opening even larger for even easier viewing, and it gives you a broader range. You don't have to look sort of straight down the pipe, otherwise you see black. Because the moment you have to tell somebody, you gotta look straight down the center. If they're off, they're gonna see black, and their first thought is, maybe it's just dark in there, and they're gonna pop their head as close to that eyepiece as they can get, which is not the best thing to do. So here are some telescope types. There is a Maksutov Cassegrain I don't recommend on here. It's actually an f15. It's very nice, but it's only 1.25 inches back. So you can't put a large diameter eyepiece on it, but that's a nice telescope for personal use. Not very good for long duration exposures because it's a very slow, as they say, telescope. It's an f15. But if you want to look at close-up detail without requiring a high magnification or a Barlow, that's a nice f15. I don't even own one, but I know the specs on it, and That's nice. I don't know whether it's a silvered secondary or a true secondary mirror, but just looking at it from here and looking how deep the concave is on the corrector plate on the front, I think it's probably a true secondary. Be a nice scope to look through. Does anybody own one? Eyepieces. Okay, a small aperture, short focal length eyepiece is difficult to look through. It creates a greater impulse to press the face into an eyepiece and creates a contamination and sanitation issue. A longer focal length eyepiece is easier to look through. A 2-inch diameter eyepiece is easier to look through. Get one that has a deep rubber cup on it, because if they do get close to it, they're still going to be, 3/8 of an inch away from the actual lenses with their eyes. And the rubber cup will block out stray local light. And if you have to use a negler and you've got more than 4 layers of glass in there, it's actually going to be darker and you have to look straight down the center of the pipe, which causes people to poke their head into the eyepiece. More pictures. Here's 3 types of eyepiece. And if you can see the numbers, here's a Pentax. This is a Pentax. It's kind of a variant of a negler. This is a 5mm eyepiece. Very, very short focal length to increase magnification. But notice how spherical the lens is on the top. Notice there's no eye guard whatsoever. You're within a 1/16 of an inch of the glass lens itself when you're looking through it. Lots of public outreach bad about that. The next thing is, if all you can do is 1 1/4 inch and you don't want to go for a negler and you don't put a Barlow on it, a 3.6mm focal length eyepiece. See how small the opening is? The human eye pupil opens to about 7mm diameter. This is about 5mm diameter. So even if your eye were to be completely dark adapted, this would produce less of an opening for light to get to your eye than your pupil will allow. So not good. This is the one I like. This is the one that I use on my Maksutov Cassegrains. It's a 28mm eyepiece. Notice how deep the rubber cup is. That's 3/8 of an inch between your eyeball and the glass. Notice how the glass is almost flat. That's how large and uniform this aperture is. So that's, I think of it as a very good eyepiece. And whereas a negler might cost you $400+, you can get this eyepiece on sale for under $100 from Orion. Not much under 100, usually in the 90s, but certainly a fraction of the price of this. These are cheap. These kinds of eyepieces you can get for probably $30 or less, but that's small in aperture. So think about doing video in addition to an eyepiece. If you really want to do eyepiece, fine, let's go with 2 telescopes. But if you're going to do that, don't bring a laptop that does all your deep sky stacking and processing, and try and get some kind of tiny computer that doesn't require a separate table. And so that the processing is automatic. You're not distracted from your audience in order to do the video. Preferably not a separate on a different tripod telescope, because that's a lot more equipment to set up, tear down, and to manage during the event. The other thing that a video live feed does, it allows a larger audience to simultaneously see what's in the telescope's current view, which allows for better social distancing. And also, if the tiny computer that you're using to show the video has a Wi-Fi field that it can put out, you can set it up so that members of the public can grab a current view over the Wi-Fi using basically a web browser on their phone. They don't have to download some proprietary app. I've done this a couple of times, and the best way to describe it is the millennials love it. So here's how to do 2 telescopes. If you really want to do 1 telescope for eyepiece and 1 telescope for camera live feed, there's a couple of ways you can do this. 2 telescopes on 2 different mounts. I've already said that's probably not the most practical way to do it. If you have both telescopes on the same mount, they can be piggybacked one on top of the other, which usually requires both telescopes to have scope rings, which is a bit more expensive. Or they can be side by side on the same bracket, on a shared bracket. Or you can have them on the altitude axis, on the elevation axis of the telescope, and they're independent of one another. They're just, the motor just drives them at the same time, which is the approach that I use. So here's the 3 different ways of doing it. This is the approach that I use, although I've done this one. I haven't done this one because these brackets are quite expensive, multiple hundreds of dollars. I've done these, and you do have to collimate both telescopes, regardless of what you're doing. You have to collimate both telescopes so that when you're looking in the eyepiece, the thing that's in the center of the eyepiece is also in the center of the camera.
Expound collimation for those who don't understand what you just said.
Okay, think of it this way. If you had 2 tubes that you were looking down and you wanted the same thing in both tubes, you have to make sure that both tubes are kind of co-aligned, collimated, to look at the same thing. You don't want tube to be askew, kind of looking over here while the eyepiece telescope is looking there, because then your target won't be in the camera. And depending upon how you mount the second telescope, you have up to 3 different axes that you have to adjust. So in this one on the left, you've obviously got up, down, left, right. The main telescope is going to be locked into the mount, so no collimation needed for that one. But the second telescope, the piggyback, you can see the screw threads on the scope rings. You're going to have to adjust the pointing of that telescope so that it lines up with whatever is in the main eyepiece. So what you do is you put a low magnification eyepiece into the main scope. You get something aligned dead center, preferably something at long distance. It can be in the daytime, even an electrical insulator on a power pole. Just make sure it's as far away as you can see. Once you have that dead center in the main scope, increase the magnification of the main scope. Put in a shorter focal length eyepiece, and then realign the main scope. Get it dead center. And since it's a fixed object you're observing, it shouldn't worry about tracking. Now you can adjust the secondary. So you can line it right up and tighten down those thumb screws on the rings so that it can't easily be bumped. Because if you notice the cables coming from the camera, unless you dress them properly, they're going to be drooping right in front of people who like to grab cables and hang on to them. So you want to dress those cables out of the way if you're doing a piggyback. But that's collimating the 2 scopes so that they're looking in the same place. The one in the center, you don't have to worry about the up-down unless there's a bend in that rail. You don't have to worry about the left-right because they're already tacked to one another. What you do have to worry about on the third one, though, is what is known as cant. So it's not just that both scopes have to be tilting up and down at the same time, but the primary scope is going to be locked into the mount. The secondary scope, parallax. You don't want it to be looking completely parallel to the main scope, because then the target won't be in the center of the video scope. It'll be off to the right side. So you've actually got to pitch the scope in just a little bit, which is actually referred to as can't, without the apostrophe, having nothing to do with cannot. So the 2 telescopes, the eyepiece one is fixed. The camera one, you have to tilt in just slightly so that they're both pointing at the same thing. Now the live video, it should be just that. It should be, through whatever algorithm you're using, live and automatic. It should not be something you have to stop and manually process, align a stack of images, post-process them, touch them up, and then you can show them what you were looking at 10 minutes ago. You want it to be a live, whatever it does. If it's not stacking, live for whatever it is. If it's stacking, you want live stacking. And if it's live stacking, you want the stack to be fairly shallow, usually less than 8 frames. Because if you make it longer than 8 frames and you switch from target to target or you realign things, you get a smear in your image and it takes too long for it to self-correct. And you'll want to, well, let me go in and delete the stack and start over again. And that becomes more operator intervention and disrupts your flow and requires you to be close to the telescope, which breaks social distancing. So you want it to be live stacking. You want the stack to be fairly shallow. Even a stacking of 3 images is a remarkable improvement. When you get to above 5, it starts to drop off because you're not doing 2 hours worth of exposures for a live event. So smearing should be something that self-corrects itself in well under a minute. Now, how you do the live video, there's several different approaches to doing this. If you can find one, there's used integrating cameras called Stellacam. You can sometimes find these on the used market. They're very good. You have to adjust them as to their stacking level and their brightness, their gamma. But once you get them set on a target, they'll stack all night long. If you then switch the type of target, you have to adjust them again. There are now off-the-shelf external integration packages to do the stacking, the live stacking for you. So you can use your existing camera, preferably from the same vendor. They'll love that, more revenue. But you can also use other brands of cameras. And so you'll find the ZWO brand has something called the ASLayer Pro. It's a custom single board computer that they've specifically designed for this purpose. There's another company that produces something called a StellarMate. And the StellarMate is a preloaded, prepackaged Raspberry Pi. They just paint it on the outside differently to make it look like it isn't a Raspberry Pi, but it is. Or you can do what I do, which is take a Raspberry Pi, throw the Indy software on it. You can throw planetarium software or imaging applications on it. And then you can write a very simple little Python script that will do the stacking for you. Remember, if you have to stop what you're doing to align, stack, and post-process every time you look at a particular target or when you switch targets, it's not an auto-stacking live view solution. You'll be distracted from your public. You may have to break social distancing to get in close. It'll probably require you to have a laptop there, and it means you need a table for the laptop. You can't run it all on, a battery pack for a, 2+ hour session. You may have to actually bring a generator, which is a bigger burden. So tone down the deep sky astrophotography aspects and focus on what you're there to do, which is the public outreach. Here's the latest trend: prepackaged live view telescopes with built-in cameras. These go for anywhere from $700 to $3,000, depending upon which brand and model you buy. It's almost as if you're buying a telescope that instead of having an eyepiece, you look in where the eyepiece would be, and there's a little TV screen. So you're not looking through an eyepiece at a live view. You're looking into what looks like an eyepiece at a little TV screen to see a stacked live image. Take a look at the telescope that they sell you with this. They put all the money into the computer and the display and the software. The telescopes themselves are wide field, very inexpensive, low focal ratio telescopes. A lot of times they're just, what would be a $50 refractor. But they do this for a reason. A low focal ratio telescope is very forgiving if your go-to and your tracking are imprecise. So if I was to look at, let's say, I don't know, Jupiter, which is maybe a 1/10 of a degree in angular size, and I give you a 3-degree field of view. I can be pretty off on my go-to and my tracking, and it would still be in the camera's view. But Jupiter's going to be smaller. So what they'll do is they'll do a digital magnification, which is essentially, if I give you more pixels in the camera and then I crop out the thing that's supposed to be magnified, I can do that up to 4x before you start to see the pixels. That's just compression. So they may look like a good solution, but they've got way too many Achilles heels in them. There are other ones that don't even have an eyepiece. You just run an app on your phone. Why does it cost so much money if it has no hand paddle and it has no eyepiece? Well, it's a unique thing that they want to sell to people that like new and unique things. So they'll charge you a lot of money for that. I'm waiting for one of those to show up at a public outreach event and then say, how come I can't plate solve with all these street lights? Can you turn out all these street lights so my telescope will work? Now, what about your own light pollution? Don't expect the public to be able to see dim, deep sky fuzzies through an eyepiece at a location where there are bright white lights. When you're setting up at a site, try and set up at a location where you're either blocking the lights or you're not in direct line of sight of near lights where the lights are farther away. And they're just unavoidable. They're going to be there. The host of the site may not have the security access to turn off the lights. Security at the location may say, you can't turn those lights off there for security, safety. They're just there. You just deal with them. It's part of public outreach. You just deal with them. And if you have a tracking telescope, make sure that the local parking lot lights don't suddenly enter your field of view. If all of a sudden you see, a bright light source popping out of your eyepiece or in your camera, you're going to have to reposition your telescope to get away from that street light. If you do provide lighting at your event, make sure it's red lighting, not white lighting, not white lanterns. Don't be the light pollution source that you bring with you. If the red is too dark for you and you need something just a touch brighter, consider multicolor LED or smart bulbs and change the color from red, which may be too dark for you, to a color like pink, which is still red, but it's a bit brighter. So if you're the operator of the telescope, sometimes you need white light for you to adjust something on the telescope or to look at some debris that might be on the eyepiece. And the best approach for that is a small white pen light, fairly cheap at your local, Target or Walmart. They're not excessively bright. The battery is easily replaceable. It's not a proprietary battery. I highly recommend not using the white flashlight on your mobile phone. They are just way too bright and they will disorient your night vision. And if you're running a public observatory, I recommend smart bulbs where you can change the color of them. This avoids having to run 2 sets of power wires and 2 light switches, so you can have a light switch for white and a light switch for red. Social distancing. The stickers or chalk marks that you use in the daytime are not visible at night, so don't think they are going to be. You're going to need something that's illuminated at night. The lighting, the LED lighting strips, if you can set them to very slow pulsing, not flashing and not solid, they will work best. And while 3000 Kelvin may be light pollution friendly, they're not bright enough for daytime, but you can dim the ones that are 6000 Kelvin. So consider going with those. Make sure they're resin encased because people may be walking on them. You may have a lot of abuse to them. If you have to hold them down, don't use duct tape that might destroy carpet or surfaces. Look for what is known as gaffer's tape. and you can drive them via a battery powered single board computer. Make sure that that's not the same battery that you're using for everything else that's going on. And it only takes a 4-wire cable to give you full color capability, because it doesn't just send voltages on the wires, it actually sends encoding for the individual LEDs as addressable as to what color and brightness they need to be. And electroluminescent or EL panels and luminaries may be bright at night, but they're not bright enough to be seen in the daytime. Okay, now we get to the tougher things socially. Masking. If there is a requirement for the public to be masked and to wear the masks properly and use the right kinds of masks, a sign or illuminated display saying this is the best approach. Give them the instructions right up front. Take the advice of your local drugstore or Walmart or Target. Put the sign right up front, allow them to read it, and then if you have to say, I'm sorry, we require masking, you're either going to have to get a mask on or leave, or wear your mask properly or leave. The rules were stated right up front. It wasn't hidden. And if they balk at it, you can be adamant, don't be violent. And if there is any escalation, be prepared to dial 911 before fisticuffs break out. Same thing goes for vaccinations and booster shots. Whatever the local regulation is, put out a sign, whatever your expectations are, whatever the host site's expectations are, and tell them what they need. Requiring somebody to show their vaccination card is considered a personal privacy issue, and there's going to be pushback, especially if public vaccination is not mandatory. I know that a lot of businesses are just saying, well, you want to work here? Get yourself shots. And commercial enterprises have the authority to do that, particularly in right to work states like Florida and Texas, which are the places most likely to say, I don't need to get no stinking vaccine. Well, the place where you work, where you get your living, may think otherwise. So if you have a requirement to do that, let people know up front. And if they have a problem with it, they need to find something else to take up their time. And if things do seem to escalate, be prepared to dial 911. Don't take it upon yourself to be the peacemaker. Ladder sanitation. The first thing you can do to avoid ladder sanitation is reduce the use of them. Lower your tripods so that kids can look straight into an eyepiece if you still have an eyepiece. Do live video so they can either look at a display or capture it on their mobile phone. If a ladder is unavoidable, use a hoop top ladder. They're safer for the public and it reduces the amount of area you have to sanitize. Use disinfectant wipes to sanitize things. Don't use sprays, because sprays can produce a spray mist that people may not enjoy. So the wipes are a better approach. Keep it to maybe 1 sheet per wipe down per observer. So you might need to bring a large supply of wipes. This is a cost of doing the events. And once you're done with a sheet, dispose of it because it's likely contaminated. Do not expect your event site host to be your trash bag. Bring your own trash disposal, dispose of them yourself. Don't expect them to do it for you. And do not litter your host site because you might not ever be asked back again.
The same thing goes for eyepiece sanitation. Offering only live video observing and not offering eyepiece observing eliminates this sanitation requirement. I do not recommend using for eyepiece sanitation or eyepiece cleaning high percentage 90+% isopropyl alcohol, or as it is known by its UPAC name, isopropanol, also known as isopropyl rubbing alcohol, or the disposable alcohol prep pads used to sterilize injection sites. We originally did this and found that after a time it degrades the rubber eye guards of the eyepieces, and over repeated cleanings it also degrades eyepiece coatings. Plus, the residual alcohol vapors are not good near human eyes. Instead, use polycarbonate lens compatible eyeglasses cleaning solution. While eyeglasses cleaning solution also contains isopropyl alcohol, it is at a much lower percentage of around 50% or less. Despite containing more water and less alcohol, eyeglasses cleaning solution is more expensive per ounce than 90% isopropyl alcohol. A homemade version of eyeglasses cleaning solution is a 50% mix of 70% isopropyl alcohol, 50% water, plus a single drop of dish sink cleaning soap. Do not use dishwasher liquid detergent or laundry liquid detergent, as they contain additional ingredients. Polycarbonate lens eyeglasses cleaning solution should be safe for cleaning eyepieces and their rubber eye guards. Clean between each observer because many viruses can be passed via the liquids in the human eye. Remove the eyepiece from the telescope, use a spritz bottle to apply the cleaning solution, let sit for a few seconds, tilt the eyepiece to let any excess roll off, then air dry or use a microfiber cloth to immediately dry. This may sound like too much effort. If so, consider going with a live view camera only and not offering observing through an eyepiece.
So safety promotion. Put some kind of signage at your event. Have your host look at the signage to make sure it's conformant to whatever they're doing. And if it's daytime, a printed sign is fine. If it's nighttime, then a clear acetate over an EL panel is probably sufficient, and you can adjust the brightness of that. And to create the acetates, you don't have to get fancy. A marker on the acetates, if you write it hard enough, is good enough. Otherwise, you can use PowerPoint and a color printer to print the acetate. And in event promotions, if you're going to do a write-up, a handout or something for your event, do indicate whatever constraints your event requires. And if you're looking to do something like hire a third party to do the sanitation for you, that's fairly expensive, but it makes the presumption that you are conformant to whatever the requirements are. And you're hoping that whoever you're paying to do it is conformant, but you're still on the hook for the conformance expected by your host. So, you know, don't go in and have some place sanitize your telescope and then presume that the next 200 people in line looking at your telescope, you only have to sanitize it once. That's nonsense. Okay. If there are any other questions or issues or alternative answers, like what kind of alcohol has what name on it, do let me know. Realize that we're all in this together. The International Astronomical Union has website postings for this. Astronomy for developing countries. Apparently, since they have to deal with other forms of pandemic, they're serious about the difference in process for doing astronomy public outreach in light of COVID-19. So if you want some stringent rules, there's a website to go for. And if you're looking at this on the YouTube site, there's a way where you can reach me either on YouTube as a comment, on Facebook, or as email. So if I miss something or you disagree with something, drop me a line. Okay, that's all I had at this point. Are there any comments or questions?
Yes, I would have like comment that if you want to actually put norms that are more stringent to the public, would be possible if it's some kind of business that is like a it's not governmental, because the rules, especially here in Florida, are more loose, and that even rules against rules posted by the state government complicates life for people who want to protect the publics and themselves. So I think if you do something in the business area where someone owns the property, they can say, I own this, that's my house, that's my rules. That will be a little bit better to do some kind of outreach than a government facility where when you're subjected to rules against the rules by the state government.
Yeah, and that's why in the slide on conformance, it gets down to the bottom line there, which is the guidelines should be no less than those of the site. So if your state is very lax, but the organization that is owning the site that you're doing the event at is more stringent, you need to operate in the more stringent mode of operation, regardless of what the state or county says. And you can do that if it's a private enterprise.
But I'm hearing a different statement there. Like if you should have another dot that says, if the guidelines should be more than those of the site. In the sense of that you want to do more. You want everybody to wear a mask. And the site says, nobody has to wear a mask here. But you don't like the fact that they don't wear a mask. You want them all to wear a mask.
That's why there's a bullet on it that says, host organization, your astronomical organization policies. So if your site says nobody has to wear masks, when you're setting up the event and you're discussing hosting, being with the event site, you need to set those policies. And if your organization has more stringent policies than the site you're going to do the event at, let the event host know in advance. We wear masks. We require a vaccination. We expect a vaccination. If they say, we don't do that where we're at, fine. Don't expect to hold the site, don't expect to hold the event there.
Fine, so, bye.
Yeah, you've got to balance all of this to the satisfaction of the event. And the event satisfaction can be gated by multiple conflicting things. But when it all comes down to it, whatever guidelines you have should be no less than those of the site. They can be more, but they can't be any less. So if your organization is bold and daring and say, we don't believe in masks or vaccinations, but you're going to a county library that says, no, everybody has to be masked and there has to be social distancing, but we don't look for vaccines. You can't deny their rules. You've got to obey their rules. So your organization has to conform.
So you're saying that if they don't wear masks, we're just not going to go to that site.
If the site says no masking and your organization says masking is required, you should negotiate that with your host. And if your host stands firm on you can't require that at the event at our site, bye-bye. Hold your event elsewhere.
Yeah.
Because they're increasing the risk for reasons that have nothing to do with, actual medical guidelines.
Yeah, and we have to think about that. For now, children younger than 12 are not vaccinated. So, and when you do astronomy outreach, that's like most of the public that comes there. The parents come to bring the kids. So it would be a center of like super spreading event because you are touching the same surfaces and you have children exposed. So yeah, we need to be more stringent in the rules than you know, and then if they don't accept it, this freedom for them is more important. Let's not do it. You know,
Yes.
just the way.
So there's no hard and fast rule here. It's just a matter of you need to negotiate with all the different levels of authority that you have to conform with. And if the end result is there's a mismatch, as the saying goes, just agree to disagree. And we'll either hold the event later when things have cleared up, or hold the event at a different site where there's a better balance between what you expect and what they allow.
You might also have a supply of masks on hand for members of the public who show up without a mask because, well, it's an outdoor event and you don't need masks
You could sell
outdoors.
them.
So
Yeah.
thing.
That's excellent.
Yeah. Have them as
So
something
you're
you
going to
could
provide
buy.
the money for that?
No, they could buy it.
Oh, so now you're selling them?
Yeah, why not? Open up a little stand.
cost.
See, now that's another thing is, forget about the pandemic. There are policies that say you can't sell things at an event at, for example, a Broward County library or park, because that makes you a vendor and you have to go through a whole bunch of business stuff in order to be a vendor. So if you're willing to give away the masks, I'm sure they would have no problem with that, so long as the masks were disposed of or the public walks away with the mask.
Are they allowed to make a donation?
They cannot be obligated to make the donation.
Right, right.
Yeah.
But you could give them away and have a hat upside down there, and people
Yeah.
put money in.
Yeah.
Can you sell something at cost if you
No,
don't make a profit
No.
on it? No.
no. Yeah, I've gone through this with Broward County. And we were bending the rules many a time with Broward County at Fox Observatory. And at some point they came back and, the special use permit had touched up that area. Okay, I get it. Yeah, okay. So,
So what about
we used to sell things like posters, astronomical posters, and that had to go away.
Planispheriums. I sold all the planispheriums.
Yes, we used to sell planispheres. Don't do that anymore either, because we didn't want to be a commercial vendor, recognized in Broward County. It's just too big an expense. We have to have all sorts of process in place, and further liabilities, and it became more than it's worth.
And it take away from our status too, as a nonprofit type of thing too, right?
No. They're fairly liberal, and the amount has gone up over the years. I think it's now $12,000 a year that you can actually take in as revenue before you have to file nonprofit taxation. Basically file a statement saying, yes, I've made money. Here's my expenses. No, we didn't make any money, but we took in money. It's much better, just if you're going to do it, just do it and get your donations through some other mechanism, like a Patreon account or just membership dues or something like that, and be magnanimous with the public and just give them out. And when you run out, state that you ran out. You're not obligated to supply them. You're doing it as a matter of convenience. And when you run out, the supply's gone. But I would take that approach as then you are providing them. So if somebody walks up without a mask and you say, I'm sorry, you're going to need to have a mask. Well, I didn't bring one. Here's a mask. And then you'll learn that they really don't want to wear one. That's why they didn't bring one. So
Right.
sometimes you can expose their true motivation based upon what gaps you're willing to immediately satisfy.
Yeah, or as my daughter said, after they decided that you didn't need to wear a mask outside if you've been doubly vaccinated, the next weekend she went out for a walk and she said, oh my God, everybody's been doubly vaccinated.
Right. All I can say is when I'm out driving around, I wear a mask anytime I'm outside the car. Because I just don't know. You know, it may be open air, but somebody could walk up to me and want to talk to me for whatever reason, ask a question like, I don't know what their vaccination status is. I know what mine is, but let's say I got the Moderna vaccine. The Moderna folks are now saying, well, we think you might need a booster. Pfizer is saying, we're still evaluating it. There's no assurance you need a booster yet. Maybe for this second variant, you might need a booster, but there's no statement on that yet. If you have Johnson and Johnson, it's like, maybe you shouldn't have had that vaccination. But you know, it varies because they're prepared in different ways and they've got different additives, and you know.
So you're saying Pfizer, the one that you said Moderna is going to need a booster now. I thought that it was out on the. I haven't heard that Moderna was being thought out versus all.
I read that this week, and it's actually Moderna themselves that are saying you need a booster for the second COVID variant.
They changed it from saying, because I know even when I got the shot, they said you may need to have a booster.
They left it open. Even for the Pfizer, they left it open as, if there's a variant, you may need a booster. And they said,
and because we only have a low percentage of the populations who are actually vaccinating all over the world. And then also what is happening, people are not wearing masks, and then you have more variants. So right now at this moment, that is a Lambda variant. So we are already L. So it's like, that is lots of variants, because the more people get exposed, more mutations happen, more variants are coming about. So one of those, like the Delta variant, is very virulent, and even for people who are vaccinated, they can transmit even though they have no symptoms. So it's better for us when we do outreach to wear masks, require the public to wear masks, or if we cannot require that, not do the event at all.
So why would we be doing outreach when there's still the pandemic going on?
We aren't.
Right.
The reason for this presentation is,
looking at it,
the reason for this presentation is, in September, a month ago, Broward County Library said they're going to resume outreach. Now they've gone radio silent, but let's get prepared so that we have policies in place. We know what we're doing. We know how to deal with all this stuff, depending upon what level they open up. So if they don't open up for the next year, this presentation may be revised next year. But if they open up 2-3 months from now, then this is still valid, as these are the things to think about when you want to go back doing outreach. But we're not doing it right now, because even if we wanted to, Broward County is not doing it.
And you referenced that it's if your organization, it's like you're saying that this would be true for anybody's organization, not for Broward.
I know some amateur organizations that are already doing public outreach again, and they're not masking, and they don't look for vaccinations, and they don't social distance. They just basically threw everything to the wind and said, we're going to do them again.
Well, that's sort of like the state saying, if you're outside, you don't have to mask.
Well, there's a difference between what you like and what's, correct healthcare procedures.
Well, I gather that you were talking about calling the police. Well, the police would probably.
No. I said, if there's pushback, tell people they have to go. If they resist, if they want to pick a fight, if it breaks out into fisticuffs, do not hesitate. Call 911 immediately.
Yeah, but they're going to say that we were in the wrong because we're trying to enforce something the state's saying they're not supposed to be enforcing.
No, we were not in the wrong because they were trying to pick a fight.
Okay.
If violence breaks out, you have assault and battery. Do you want to be liable for that? Or do you want to be the one, as soon as you saw wind of it, you called 911 and got yourself off the liability? Now, if the police come by and handcuff children or shoot people, that's on them. If you
Yeah.
see people physically, or verbally abusing one another, it's okay to call the police. If the police do not respond properly, it's not because, you wanted them to respond improperly.
No,
So
I was
that's why it
worried
would be
about that.
advantage to do in a private property, because then there would be no problem. Like if we are doing in a public, like state or county facility, there are those rules there against rules. But if we are in a private property, then the owner can establish the rules, and we say yes or no to the rules.
Yes. But
Well,
most of the
if,
public
private-
outreach that we've ever done has been on libraries, parks, or public schools.
Yeah, and where would you do this on a private property?
We have done private property before. We've had restaurants, hotels, and private homes that were holding social events. There's not a lot of money to be made in commercial outreach, but you can make money in commercial outreach. Think of all the people that provide talent agencies for tourism. They consider astronomical observing at a public event as a way to freshen up what's going on. So if you've been doing the same, annual corporate holiday party for the past 5 years, and it's always been the same, variety acts being booked, if you throw in public astronomy, well, not even public astronomy, if you throw in viewing through a telescope as part of your corporate event, it gives the audience something new to do. And we've done those kind of events at both small and large corporate events. And they're not bashful about paying good money. Tony and I years ago went to the Fontainebleau for a Canadian insurance company's annual $1 million seller salesman's event. And we showed up with equipment before we even set it up. They handed us a check for $800, which we told them in advance, this is going to be the fee. There's going to be 2 of us and you have to pay in advance and there's no rain checks. And they said, here's your check. Now there was no rain. Everything went off beautifully. And it was just 1 telescope.
Wow.
So there'll be some money to be made in doing these, but don't count on it to be big time. And do count on some of the events, such as a hotel on Miami Beach that wanted to do the Cisco annual sales event. And they did not want us setting up on the wood deck or the cement platform. We had to set up on beach sand.
Oh, no.
Setting up a telescope in an area where there's blowing sandpaper particles, not good for
geez.
optics. And the second thing was, we're 20 yards out onto the beach. How do I get the equipment out there? You carry it, you drag it. Like, that's no fun.
No.
But we did it. I think for that one, we only made I think it was $600. But that had 5 people with telescopes.
Mm.
So. Any other questions? Comments?
I have a technical question.
Sure.
Is there just for my own knowledge, is there a standard for the diameter of an eyepiece tube?
There's 2 of them, 1 1/4 and 2 inch. That's the 2 common ones.
Gotcha.
And no, that was like if you have like old crappy telescopes, you had a little small one, like for toy
Oh,
telescopes.
I don't even count the 0.965. There is one that really cheap telescopes uses. It's 0.965 diameter eyepiece receiver, and the eyepiece openings are just way too small.
And it's really
you know,
crappy telescopes.
yeah, but it makes them cheaper that way. Now that was back when they used to make the telescope eyepiece tubes out of metal. You know, they have to, have a router to make them. And that means, less metal is less expensive. But nowadays, I would say more than half of the telescope eyepiece shells are made out of plastic. They may be, silver, shiny plated plastic, but they're still plastic. The honest ones just make them out of hard, shiny black plastic. And that's fine. The optics don't care. So then it's a matter of, why is the 2-inch eyepiece so much more expensive than the 1.25 inch? And why is there a step up in price between 0.965 and 1.25 inch? Because they can ask for it.
The other thing is that when you look at the eyepiece, like if you set the eyepiece tube standing up like in a table, you have the chubby, the smallest eyepieces are the one that has more magnification because of the focal point. And those are the worst to actually look through. And then the tallest eyepiece is that the wide field of view, they're more comfortable for you to look, but they have low magnification because the focal point is far away. So the difference is like if you have a eyepiece that has a small number in millimeters, that one has more magnification, and the larger numbers are the one that has less magnification. But the ones that has less magnification has more sky. That's what we call a field of view. So the ones with the larger numbers, you can see more skies. The ones with the smaller numbers, you see less sky.
And I would say that generally holds true, but as soon as you get to long focal length telescopes, the degrees of field of view is not the same. So if I look at these 3 eyepieces and I put them in the exact same telescope, and it happens to be a, let's say an f7.5 telescope, then I'm going to need the 5mm eyepiece to get a good deal of magnification. The 3.6mm eyepiece will be too small an opening to get a sufficient amount of light through it. And the 28mm eyepiece, even though it gives you more light into the eye, 28mm on an f7.5 is not much magnification. So what you want to do is you want to pair it with the right telescope. So if you take that 28mm eyepiece and you pair it with an f12.5 or an f15 telescope, that's more magnification than that 5mm is going to get you on an f7.5.
Yeah, I have a f10 telescope.
Yeah.
And my favorite eyepiece is the 40mm because that's the one that I can see more sky and has less distortion, less aberration. I love that 40. And one of my favorite objects to actually show is the Pleiades anyway. So the Pleiades are larger than the moon, so I can show a lot of the stars because I have an f10, so it shows less sky because it's an f10 than a f12 or f15. But then I choose the larger eyepiece aperture that I can have. That will be, the long focal length eyepiece, so the one with large numbers. But I can see more sky. That's less magnification, but I can see more sky.
So your Schmidt is 150mm?
Yeah, it's an f10.
Yeah. If you look at my 150mm f12.5 versus your 150mm f10, I can put a 28mm in my scope and I will have a narrower field of view. So I'll only get to see maybe 4 out of the 7 sisters, where you'll see 5 or maybe 6 out of the 7 sisters. But the difference is I get more magnification on things like the moon and planets.
Yeah.
And I get people drag racing behind my house.
Oh, okay.
That's
Yeah,
what that
and
is.
then with your Mac, the one,
Mhm.
and when we were observing the sun, you could see the granulation
Yes.
very nicely. That is an excellent view.
Yes, 150 millimeter f12.5 Maksutov Cassegrain with even a 28 millimeter eyepiece has a dynamite view. The clarity is there. The field of view is just right. It's just a touch larger than a full moon. So you can see a little dark line around the outside of the full moon. Planets are nicely magnified. You can see the Orion Nebula nice because it brings in more light. You can see nice, light and dark areas on the Orion Nebula. So as I say, I've got enough experience of doing public outreach that's my best mix. Is I'll bring the Ioptron IEQ 45 and the 150 millimeter f12.5 Maksutov Cassegrain, and I'll bring a 28 millimeter and a 35 millimeter Orion Deep View eyepiece. That's a crowd pleaser. Until I go to Big Cypress National Preserve where it gets really dark, and there I'll bring the same IEQ 45, but I'll bring my 180 millimeter f15 Maksutov Cassegrain with the same 2-inch 28 and 35, which gives you more magnification, more light gathering. It's just showing off.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
And then that was the first time I look at the Orion Nebula through your telescope, and that setup, I have like a bunch of kids following me because I was talking to them. So I have like kind of 10 kids around me, and I went to look through your telescope. When I saw the Orion Nebula for the first time, when I looked at your telescope, I went like, holy shit. And then all the kids go, mommy, shit. I'm like, oh no. So I said a bad word for kids because it was amazing. It was like you could see the Running Man, you could see all the details. It was very nice.
And I have had people with really good vision report that with my 180 millimeter Mac on a clear dark night at Big Cypress with the 35 millimeter, they can see color in the Orion Nebula. And I don't, I just see, grays. But if they say they see color, fine.
I see it.
Yeah, okay. Well, you've
I used to see it. I don't know now.
I don't know now, but you used to see it.
Yeah.
I want to do that star magnitude test with you again.
Yes, I should do that. I actually could see Uranus on Harry Campbell. Naked eye, I could see it.
Yep.
I could see the very tiny stars on I think you test me on Capella or it was on Leo. I could see all the little stars that you and Les couldn't see.
Leo, yeah.
Yes, and then Les, she memorized Leo. It's impossible for her to see that.
No, that's when we handed you the laser and said, point the laser at the star that you see. And then we were looking through the binoculars to see if you really were pointing at a star, and you were. We refer to that as the Arno or Don test.
Yes. I think Arno has better eyes than me because to see Neptune is like, whoa.
Yeah. But I don't think his eyes are as good as they used to be. He's gotten older now.
Yes, me too. Well, nobody escapes.
Yeah. Okay. Any comments or questions?
Hey guys, I got a question for you.
Sure, go ahead.
It's David. I decided to put my mic on. You guys are talking about looking through a telescope. The problem I have with mine is when I go through the finder scope, I can never get to center the object. It's always a hair off. And I did the trick.
That's called collimation. Your finder scope needs to point at the same thing that the center of your telescope does. The best way to do that is in the daytime. There are small adjustment screws on your finder scope.
Correct.
And what you do is you turn off the motor if you have a motor on your telescope mount. you turn off the motor and you manually point it at a telephone or power pole 2 miles away, as far away as you can point it, and get it dead center, and then look through your finder and adjust your finder until it matches the center view of your telescope.
The problem is when I've done that, I cannot get, there's always like 1 hair's width. It just won't go that way.
Oh,
It's always in the
Oh,
middle
it's
of the line.
the ones with 3 screws, right?
I believe,
is it 2 screws and a spring?
It's actually, it's 2 rings with 2
Okay.
screws on each ring.
Oh, you should be able
So
to point that one any way you want.
That's what I thought, but I did it. So I took all the screws so that they were no longer sticking out. They were flush with the ring. Then
Yeah.
I tried to move the finder scope to line up with the object, and even that didn't work. It's like I need a little bit more of a hair's
Huh.
width more of the ring to let that finder scope weigh against
Oh,
it.
I know what it is. I know what it is. The finder scope bracket is probably not lined up. So if you take the finder scope off, you'll probably see 1 or 2 screws, preferably 2 screws, into the metal of the tube of your telescope. Do not unloosen them all the way, because there might be nuts inside the body of the telescope tube. You don't want those falling out onto your optics. So even a 1/10 of a turn, just enough to break the tension of the finder bracket to the metal of the tube. Once you've done that, leave it that, just hair slightly loosened, put the finder back in, and then try and collimate it again. And if it's off just a little bit more, just grab the finder bracket and muscle it just a little bit and see if you can now get it dead center. Then take the finder out of the bracket, tighten the bracket back up, and you should be good to go.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
It's most likely like, the bracket is supposed to be parallel with the tube of the telescope,
Yes.
and might be just as skewed to the side, to the left or to the right. And
Yeah.
that's what makes it impossible I hate
Well,
those kind of finders.
when they build them at the factory, trust me, they do not attempt to collimate them. They throw the bracket shoe on there, they tighten the 2 screws down, and they put the finder in a bag and put it in a box, and there you go. So if the bracket's off by a degree, you'll figure that out.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I think that's what the problem is. I
Oh,
had
okay.
that with a Meade telescope one time, a small ETX 90, and the finder just never could get it to center. It was always off to one side. And then I pulled the finder out and found out, oh, there's 2 screws in this thing. I loosened them just slightly because I thought there might be nuts and washers on the inside, and then wrapped on it with the butt end of a screwdriver, just enough to like skosh it over a bit. It doesn't have to be much. It may not even be that visible. Put the finder back in, dead center, took the finder out, tightened the 2 screws, and worked like magic after that.
Great. And my telescope happens to be a Meade.
Well,
You think they do it right?
Like I said, everybody's got a brand name that they know and love primarily because they own, and it cost them good money at the time. So if they badmouth it, then it kind of is indicative that maybe they didn't buy the right thing. But every telescope manufacturer has got its problems. There is no perfect telescope brand.
And this was actually given to me, this telescope.
Yeah. Well, a lot
You
of
might have been there. I was
a lot-
at Markham some years ago, and somebody goes, "Hey man, want a free telescope because the motor didn't work?" And I thought, "Wow, it's bigger than the one I have. I think I'll take it." I found out the motor is I think there's a screw is what do you call it when it's not stripped or something, and it's not an azimuth mount. My other scope is an azimuth mount. I found out the equatorial mount doesn't move like you think it does. It doesn't go across. It took me a while to figure out how to move it
No,
around.
I've actually been the bearer of bad news to people that are first-time users of equatorial scopes, saying, you're going to have to line it up this way every time you use it. Every time I use it? Yes, every time you use it. Otherwise, you will not be able to move the telescope to a place you want to look. because they would bring it and they would line up their equatorial mount as if it was Azimuth and say, how come I can't get to this part of the sky? Because you've got it lined up right for the wrong axis. And then when I show them how to do equatorial, well, what if I can't see Polaris from my house? I don't know what to tell you. That's just the way it works.
So it's maybe not good first time telescope.
I agree. My first time telescope was a Sears Roebuck altitude azimuth manual mount. I think it was a 70 millimeter doublet refractor with the yield 0.965 millimeter eyepieces. And I struggled with that thing. It was rickety, wobbly. I got the Saturn with its rings in that thing. I was hooked for life. I still own that telescope. I haven't used it in years, except as this is an example of what not to get.
Right.
But
I knew somebody.
The one that I really tell people not to get is one by Celestron. Celestron has two short Newtonians that the Newtonian reflector telescope is identical except for one thing. At the bottom end of the focusing draw tube, they screw in a single element lens that is a poor man's Barlow. So they can take a scope that should have a maximum magnification of about 120 and make it, 200 plus.
Oh, remember the other one that had that lens, and the tube was screwed on the mount, and you could not flip after the meridian.
Oh, that was another thing is Celestron at their low end is notorious for they don't put the tube in tube rings because that would cost too much money. They bolt the telescope directly onto the mount. And if it's a Newtonian, you need to rotate the tube. Otherwise, it's hard to look at things that are near the horizon. And you can't. You can't get the tube around to look through it. So you're left with crawling under the telescope to look through it. So yeah, there's many a bad telescope I've seen. If you buy a telescope that's in the everything soup to nuts and it's in the $350 or less range, you might want to talk to somebody before you make that commitment, regardless of brand.
A pair of binoculars.
Yeah, if you need an instrument, $100 pair of binoculars can be very fine.
Speaking of Celestron, I bought a Celestron microscope for my kid.
Yeah.
And when I tried to install the software, it wouldn't let me because it said there's malware on it. I searched it and it had gambling sites on it. I called Celestron and they said they would not make any software available that didn't have links leading you to online gambling sites. It was very strange.
Because that's how they make money to offset the cost of the instrument.
Have you tried to download the program directly from their site?
Don't recall. A couple of years ago. They said that I did call that I couldn't find it on their site at that time, and they said it wasn't available. I think they said that they just bought it from someone else, put the name Celestron on it, and sent it out.
That happens a lot. For example, Celestron is not Celestron. Celestron is actually a parent company known as Synta, S-Y-N-T-A, out of China. And they don't make a lot of the products that they sell. They buy up products at very low cost from other companies, and they pay to have the Celestron branding put on them. So if you had a microscope with a camera in it, and the camera needed a Windows software driver or a mobile phone driver, that may be entirely up to that third party that sold Celestron the product that they rebadged as Celestron. So if that company in China that makes the product can offset the cost of manufacturing of the product by throwing in some bloatware that promotes other products or gambling sites or even adult sites. That's just what comes along for the ride. Now, if you pay attention enough to the camera, the electronics of it, that probably comes from yet another, third-party Chinese company. In which case, if you look up the chip that makes up the camera, you might find that there are drivers directly available for that runs under Windows, for which you can just use, Windows for its own app to look at that. Windows has a camera app. So if you want to look at the microscope, and the microscope has a camera in it, and you can get a Windows conformant driver for the chip that's in the camera, you don't need their stinking app.
What an excellent idea. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It has a camera and it was
Yes.
the software for the camera.
Yes.
That's exactly right, Monroe. Thank you.
Yep. Like I said, if you just plug the USB connection into the computer without their app installed, and then you go into Windows and you say, hey, Windows, show me by connection what's plugged into that connector. It'll likely tell you what kind of camera chip is plugged in there. And then you just go looking for a Windows compatible driver chip for it. And then you just let normal Windows applications that can talk to Windows cameras or scanners be your app. How do I know this? Because it's exactly what I did with my microscope camera. I didn't like their stinking app always wanting to poke its advertisements in my face while I'm trying to use it. So I just said, let me find out what chip's in that camera. I found out the chip, got a Windows compatible driver for it. And then I just use, Windows camera app. So always look below the covers.
By the way, it's very nice to show my meteorites with that camera.
Yep. Let's see, I've got it back over here. Ta-da. Ta-da. This is it. It has a little suction cup on the base. Plugs in via USB. And it comes with this nifty little reticle stand. It's just a piece of hard plastic. And it has markings on it. And then this has a suction cup that you just plop down on there and you throw the clamp. And now you've got a little table stand and a gooseneck on the camera. And then you can adjust the brightness and the zoom factor. It goes up to 500x, but if you know anything about a telescope, and when they say it goes to 500x, not in the Florida humidity and light pollution, it'll go to maybe 120x. Same thing here. If you don't get the right lighting on an object, or if it has other problems, 70x is plenty of magnification to look at most things. And it has a ring LED light of white LEDs on the inside that is god awful bright. So they have a little adjustment thing here where you can change the brightness of it. But that will work with Windows Camera app, because the chip that's in it, it's not a microscope camera chip. It is literally a camera chip, as in you would find in a cell phone from 5 years ago. Okay. Anything else?
Yeah, I used to buy a Kodak lens cleaner. Smelled like ammonia. I don't know what that does to coatings or to rubber.
I don't think the ammonia would be good for the UV protective coatings.
Yeah.
The anti-scratch coatings would probably be fine with ammonia, because you use that with, if you get glass cleaner, like Windex Ammonia D, it's got a little bit of ammonia in it.
Yeah.
And that seems to be fine for cleaning glass itself. Glass itself is glass, it's high density crystalline silicon that's been fired at high temperature. So it's reasonably durable stuff. But if you have plastic lenses, polycarbonate lenses, you want a hard shellac on the surface of it to keep it from getting scratched. But when it comes down to coatings to not transmit UV and things like that, those have to be, best way to describe it is softer to pick up the high energy UV photons, and generally change them to something darker. So it'll be like silver halide. My glasses have the auto darkening, which is just a splash on some silver halide solution. And after about 10 years, that tends to disintegrate, which is time for me to go get new glasses. That's like the warning signal indicator is time to go get new glasses. The coating's starting to wear off.
By the way, probably 5,000 to 6,000 years old technology, glass, not shabby, right?
Yes, yes. Even before they got rid of the impurities and bubbles and things like that in glass, they were using glass industrially. And it was only when we wanted to use glass for higher precision optics that glass started to get refined into, you know, something that didn't have distortions and bubbles and things like that in it. And one of the guys that really worked on that was a guy named Fraunhofer, known for those emission and absorption lines in spectra. So.
But before him, Galileo Galilei.
Galileo did make eyepieces out of glass, but if you ever looked at Galileo's original eyepieces, you wouldn't want to look through them. You would go,
No.
this is a piece of crap. In fact, the inexpensive clone Galileo scope that Night Sky Network sold, the eyepiece that comes with that has maybe the same focal length as one of the Galileo eyepieces did, but the 2-element glass lenses are miraculously better than whatever Galileo ever looked through. Because they're modern glass.
Just recently had prisms put in my glasses because my eyes were so tired all the time, and amazing what the difference prisms make in a glass. And they won't put it in earlier. They say normally your glasses are not something that your eyes will get lazy about, not not do. But with prisms, they say that's a different story, that your eyes will become dependent, like a drug, I guess, or something, on the prisms to be there.
Well,
but they say that your eyes are so tired, you need it.
Yeah. Are they poro prisms or are they just traditional prisms? You know what kind of prism it is?
I didn't ask, no.
Okay. Because a regular prism would split the light into multiple colors. So
I don't see multiple colors. So well,
if all it does is it changes the angle at which the light enters your eyes, then that's probably poro prisms, which makes the lenses a little bit thicker.
My lens don't look any thicker,
Okay.
but then I would be very aware of it, though. I mean, it could be like a millimeter thicker, and I wouldn't be aware. But it's 10 minutes after 12, right?
Oh no.
Okay, it's pumpkin time. So let me stop sharing.
It goes by so fast.
And then I'll stop recording.